Are you green yet?
Yeah.
He's green. Oh, it blinks at a different place. Wait. So I just got finished writing a book in a series that we're doing at PI, and the topic is what is the relationship between the kingdom of God and the church, and so I'm just going to take a little idea out of that and talk about it today, because one of the things that is always really interesting is that when we talk about church, what comes up in our minds in terms of a definition or the idea of it is interesting as it compares to what the Bible talks about. And what is that? Now, it's really interesting. To me, this is a really interesting topic because Jesus is the one who made up the term. He's the one that came up with it. And there's a lot of talk about it throughout the New Testament, especially as you get into the book of Acts. But what that is, what is he talking about, is a really good question that needs to be asked when you talk about. But I'm going to come at it from a very specific angle. I'm not going to try to necessarily define what church should be or church shouldn't be in terms of this morning. We're going to look at a scripture together, and I'm going to kind of dig into it a little bit, and then I'm going to let you run with that. Okay. So I'm going to look at Matthew chapter 16, about halfway through the chapter. It starts in verse 13 and then goes through in the paragraph there. Okay, and we'll look at those in just a second. But I want to set the scene for this. For those of you who just got back from Israel, then this will be kind of fun. So there's up in the north of Israel. There near a city that's now called Tel Dan. There's a region up there that used to be Caesarea Philippi. That's not what they call it anymore. But Caesarea Philippi was up in that area. Tel Dan used to be the city of Dan. Dan changed it. It was Lachish or something like that, way thousands of years ago. And then Dan conquered that area. Dan being one of the tribes of Israel, and then they called the city Dan, and that was kind of one of the places where they hung out, and that was actually one of the centers of worship of when they did the golden calf worship, and when Israel split between Judah and Israel, and there were actually two nations for a while. The worship of Israel, Judah had Jerusalem, the right place, in terms of what God set up in terms of the temple and the worship there. But Israel had Dan, and they set up a lot of stuff up there. Okay, so I want to get back to where in that region when Caesarea Philippi was there, because in Jesus' time, Caesarea Philippi was one of the cities that he visited, and that's what we're getting ready to look at. Now, what's interesting about Caesarea Philippi, what's really interesting about Caesarea Philippi, is that it is in the time that Jesus was on the earth, it was not a city that any good Jew would go to. Even though it was within the realm of Palestine back then, the Jews would say that should be part of our territory. The Romans didn't care. They told them because they were a colony of Rome at that time. They told them what their borders were and what they could do. But Caesarea Philippi was the center of Pan worship, and Pan was one of the Roman gods. Is also a combination. It was kind of a combination between Roman and Greek god at them. Pan. I don't know if you guys remember. You get to see the picture of the half goat, half man pan flute. That's why they call it a pan flute, because Pan played it. But he was one of the gods that was worshipped at that time. They had a temple, the temple of Pan. In fact, for all of that area was in Caesarea Philippi. I've actually been there they have the ruins of the old temple there. And it's built into a cliff. So there's Caesarea Philippi, there's a cliff right there. And then, and today, if you go there, there's a platform that's all rock. It looks like a ledge of the cliff coming out, but it's kind of been polished, and it's a big platform where they did all the rituals and things for the temple worship there. To the side, they had these. They still have ruins of them there, but it's like these stable cages, and that's where they kept the goats. And they did all kinds of things in temple worship with those goats. Some of them things we won't talk about. We shouldn't talk about. It was grotesque. It was lewd. It was horrible. And during the festival times of the year, they used to have one time a year where everybody would come to the temple, and then they would engage in a lot of stuff going on in terms of the temple worship there to the god Pan. But there was this platform, and the platform back in that day actually had a nickname because it was solid rock, and it kind of came out of that cliff. On the cliff, you could see they had cutouts. They still are there. The cutouts, the little statues that were in those alcove cutouts are no longer there, but the cutouts are still there where they had statues of all the nymphs that kind of went along with the god Pan. So I'm standing there. We got up on the platform and we could see, and what's in the guide said, now come over to the side of the platform. If I'm on the edge of the platform looking out, like where all the people would be standing, then to the right, there's this little dried up creek there, and the creek's not there anymore. But he said that you can see that there's a little leftover idea. You could tell that there used to be like a little cave right there. He said, and then the water used to come out of that. And there used to be a river. This was one of the sources of the Jordan River way back when. It's dried up now, but water actually came out of the ground in that cave and flowed down this creek. And he said, now I want to give you kind of a concept of what the significance of this. He said, because this platform, solid rock, was actually called the Rock back in Jesus' day. That's what they called it. If you were part of Pan worship and all that, then they referred to the place we go to worship and the platform that was on as the Rock. So what's interesting is that in that mythology, that Pan was one of those mythological gods, the Greek gods things. In the mythology, anywhere water came from the ground as a spring was considered to be an entrance into Hades, or the underworld. So that was known as the gate to Hades. Okay, everybody with me? So now let's go and we get to this passage. So Jesus, in Matthew 16, Jesus goes with his disciples. He's taking them. They've just fed 4,000 miraculously. And Jesus had this discussion with them, and the disciples have good days and they have bad days. There's days where the good days when they participated in feeding 5,000 people or feeding 4,000 people miraculously with 5 loaves and 2 fish, or with 7 loaves in the case of the 4,000. So that all these things are happening, and then they have bad days, like when Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees," and the disciples think he's talking actually about bread. Disciples thought he was getting mad at them because they forgot to bring bread with them. And so he's like, come on, guys, clue in here. I mean, you just saw that we fed, like 5,000 people and 4,000 people. And yeah, come on, let's roll with this. I'm not talking about actual bread. I'm talking about the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So all that's going on. And then it says that Jesus went with his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. So Jesus is taking them to this city that is the center of Pan worship. No good Jew goes there. And I just want you to put yourself in the position. So they're on their way, and the disciples are like, well, Jesus goes from town to town, so we go with him. Where are we going, Jesus? And he says, well, I think we're going to Caesarea Philippi today. Excuse me? We're going to Caesarea Philippi. And they're like, can we go there? Is that okay? I mean, don't tell my mom. I mean, we can't. What's he doing? Why are you taking us there? And so Jesus takes them. Now, it doesn't say where in Caesarea Philippi they went. It just says they went to the district of Caesarea Philippi. But I have a suspicion, because of what Jesus says next, that he went right up to that temple. That he not only went to the city they're not supposed to go to, he went to the spot that they should never go to. And he walked up, And in my mind, he got up and stood up on that platform. And he looked at his disciples, who are really, really confused and looking around, making sure that nobody that knows them sees them there. It's like a Christian, going into a liquor store to buy, buy something, and they think it's okay, but they sure don't want anybody to see them do it. That kind of. So they're standing there, and Jesus said, "Okay, here's the question: who do people say that I am?" So the issue now is, I'm standing on the territory of Pan. I'm asking you, who do people think I am? And they say, some think you Elijah, some think you're Jeremiah, some think you're one of the other prophets, some think you're Moses returned. Some people have lots of ideas about who you are. Some think you're John the Baptist. And Jesus said, well, who do you say that I am? And then Peter answers, you are the Christ, or literally, you're the anointed one, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus, standing there, said, that is amazing, Peter. Probably because it's like, wow, out of all the things you said, Peter, you actually got something right. That's pretty amazing. I am impressed. Because that didn't come from you, that was actually revealed to you from heaven. And then Jesus says, Peter, your name actually means a little rock. But I'm going to tell you that on this rock, I'm going to build my church. I wonder where Jesus was standing. And then he says this, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And then he says, and I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. And then he says, and whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Now, I want to break this down just a little bit for us, okay? What Jesus said is really remarkable in many ways because, number one, the church doesn't exist yet. The disciples had never heard him use that word before. Now, the word existed. The word is ecclesia or ecclesia, okay? That's a word. It was a Greek word. It was used. It was actually used in that time. It didn't have anything to do with any religious connotation. It was actually used primarily in a political context at that time. And it literally means, the definition of it is called out ones. It was used most often in that time to mean you were part of an elite club or a important group, such as the Roman Senate. Like it was used in a lot of political organizations or groups used the word ecclesia. Part of the elite group or the called out ones. We're the ones that have been chosen to make decisions at the highest level. Okay? That was how the word was generally used at that time. And it's really interesting that Jesus plucks that. Jesus did that a lot. He actually did the same thing with the word apostle. The apostle wasn't a religious term when Jesus started using it. It was actually a term that rooted back to Alexander the Great. But Jesus takes this term, this Greek term, it's not a Jewish term, it's a Greek term, and he says, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to build my called out ones. I'm going to build my elite group who will make decisions at the highest level. Now, the disciples are starting to listen to him. We think, wow, Jesus is saying, I'm going to build my church. And the disciples are thinking, that's wonderful. What's a church? I mean, what is that? What are you talking about? And Jesus said, okay, this church is going to storm the territory of hell, and and hell can't stand against it. That's about this church. And in fact, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. I'm going to give you keys, and you're going to loose things and bind things. Now, what's happening here is so interesting because Jesus is talking about something that doesn't exist yet. And Jesus is actually prophesying something. And here's the really cool thing is Jesus is introducing them to the idea that there's going to be the church. And he's actually telling them what the identity of the church is and the purpose of the church is. He's giving both of those things in this prophetic utterance that he's making in that moment. And the disciples are completely confused. They don't know what he's talking. They don't know why they're there. They don't understand the significance of anything, but Jesus is speaking out something that's going to be. And so from Jesus' point of view, here's the deal. He's saying, you're right, I am the anointed one. I'm the Messiah. I am the king who has been prophesied and coming. And here's what's getting ready to happen. I'm going to build my elite group of called out ones who will make decisions at the highest level. And that's who they are. That's the identity of the church. What do? They take back territory that Satan has stolen and gotten away with. They are going to storm the gates. It is going to be an offensive, not a defensive group of people. And they're going to be so powerful that they will be able to take what I'm bringing and they will be able to bring it with such force that hell needs to build gates to try to keep it out, and the gates won't hold. That's how powerful this thing that I'm talking about is. Are you following me? So Jesus is talking about who this church is, and he's also talking about what they will do. And then he says, okay, here's what it is going to look like. I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. So this church has keys to the kingdom. Now, what do keys do? They open stuff, okay? And you're going to open stuff. You're going to open, so you're going to be my group making decisions at the highest level. So one of the things you're going to do is you're going to open stuff. Now, I want you to picture this. I want you to picture, okay, you got the spiritual veil, right, between the spiritual world and the physical world. And the keys to the kingdom means that's another way of saying access to the resources of heaven. So let's just take that and let's trade those things. So I'm giving you keys that will give you access to the resources of heaven, which means that you'll be able to reach across that veil, which is the separation between the physical and the spiritual world. You'll be able to put that in the lock and open up a door that gives you access to resources of heaven. Why? Because I want you to lock stuff up and I want you to release stuff. I want you to reach in to things that I'm giving you a key to, take hold of it, and pull it across the veil from there to here. That's what the church does. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like going around and finding where evil is and where Satan is and binding those things. You see, he makes this statement. He says, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. That's an interesting way of saying that. And he says, whatever you loose on earth will have been already loosed in heaven. What's he saying? Well, there are things that God has already destined and designed to happen on the earth. There are things that the resources are already there in the warehouse. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your key that I'm giving you, and you're going to reach in, you're going to unlock, and things that have already been bound in heaven, you're simply going to enact it. You're going to make it real in the physical space that we live in. Got that? So there are things, and is there anything that needs to be bound up in our world? Is there anything that needs to be tied up, undone, blocked, locked away? There's a few things that could use some binding. And is there anything that needs to be loosed? Is there anything that needs to be released? Is there anything that needs to be caused to happen that is not currently happening? I think there could be a few things that we could think of. But Jesus is saying, and here's what I want us to really grasp here, is that Jesus is standing right in the enemy's territory, right smack dab in the enemy's territory, and saying, let me tell you who My guys are. We've established who I am. Let me tell you what's getting ready to happen. I'm establishing my elite guard. That's going to go from here all the way to the end of the age. And this is going to be a people that when they understand, when they get who they are, they're going to be able to offensively go after Satan and what he's trying to do. And Satan will be so concerned about it, he'll try to set up defense against it, and he can't. It won't work. And then we're going to have keys to be able to unlock things that are in heaven right now that need to be released on the earth that will help us bind up stuff that needs to be bound and release stuff that needs to be released. That's what it looks like. That's to have the keys to the kingdom. He actually gave us an example right there in that statement of what he's talking about when he says, I can give you the keys to the kingdom. And this is what it looks like: loosing and binding. So this is ideal. Here's how I'm going to close with this. I'm not going to tell you what the church is supposed to be. This is how it should look. You can't have any buildings, or we can't, the leadership should be different, or this. I'm not, what Beat and Bow does, that's really the church, and churches aren't really, we're not going to define any of that. What I'm leaving you with is Jesus had a very clear vision of who the church was and what it does. And he spoke it before it even existed. I'm going to build my church, he said. We don't build it, he does. It's going to be so offensively strong, the gates of hell will not be able to keep it out. You're going to have keys to be able to reach into heaven and unlock things. And what that looks like is you're going to bind stuff that needs to be bound, and you're going to loose stuff that needs to be loosed. That's a pretty cool definition of the church. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I just taking this picture that Jesus painted prophetically in the New Testament, Lord, I ask you to help us to step in and see from his perspective. See it from what he was trying to show his disciples and the rest of us as we read those words. That who we are as believers, who we are as his ecclesia, who we are as his elite called out ones, making decisions for this world at the highest level. Help us to understand it in a way that changes how we think and how we act. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys. Bless you today. Yes, thank you.